I I went to the book of Ecclesiastes and I put up I'm trying to, in my devotional time, read the books that are obscure. So I've been for a while in the book of Habakkuk, and I've really enjoyed the book of Habakkuk and some of the other books. And then, of course, I enjoy Ecclesiastes. A lot of people may not see Ecclesiastes as a book to go to, especially in a year like 2020. Well, it's a book that somehow has a morbid undertone, but it is a book that has such a lot of gems. And I want to share with you one particular verse that comes out of a very well-known chapter 3, where there is a time for everything under the sun. But I'm not even going to focus on that, because I'm sure we've all heard so many sermons or presentations on a time for this and a time for that. And anyway, we often don't get beyond that. And I'm going to be concentrating what follows that list. And we're basically going to focus on verse 11 of chapter 3, the book of Ecclesiastes. So if you've got your Bibles with, I will urge you to please open up the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God, and then let us sharpen the sword by reading it together. And I'm going to read it in 3 translations. It's always a good thing to read a particular passage, anything that the Spirit is placed on your heart or you feel impressed by. Read it in multiple translations. It really it's a great tool to have all these translations that we have, and an approach to use. So I'm going to read first of all in the New American Standard Bible, which is a very direct translation, very accurate word-for-word translation, even more so than the King James. And then we'll progress to the dynamic translation, one of my favorite, the New Living Translation. So here it goes. He has made everything appropriate. I like that word, appropriate, in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. The New King James reads as follows: He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. And lastly, the NLT states, yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart, but even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. That last portion is very well put. The whole people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. So yes, it's one of these passages that resembles the passages that one would find in Paul's epistles. It's a loaded passage, a verse. Every verse has so much layers and depth to it that you really have to proceed verse by verse and actually spend a lot of time pondering, wrestling with these verses, because in fact 3 points are highlighted in this verse, and my 3 points, or the structure of what I'm going to present tonight, is basically on the 3 points that come out of this verse. And well, I also realize that we've all probably had a busy and heavy week, so I don't want to prolong this, but I hope that you are inspired to pick up your Bibles and read through the book of Ecclesiastes. Just a bit of background, quick. The main message of Ecclesiastes could be summed up in the following. no one truly knows what's good for humanity. Okay, like the author, which of course we believe to be King Solomon, and he basically tried everything under the sun. And we too may embark on several quests in the pursuit of finding satisfaction, finding out what the ultimate knowledge is, but it's not found within humanity itself. And when we pursue a life or embark on a journey without God, there is without a doubt disappointment on the horizon, discouragement and disappointment on the horizon. So the book is basically warning the audience, the primary audience, it is assumed by scholars to be his son. He's trying to inform his son so that his son doesn't make the same mistakes that he had made. You know, Solomon was a very wealthy man. His wealth comparatively, you know, I don't believe that there probably would have been a man with that amount of wealth ever. He had gold that was stacked. If you read all the basically in First Kings, Second Kings, you read about the gold that it was amassed, the silver. It's actually, you can't get your head around the figures. So he was a very wealthy man. So he tried everything. I think 700 wives and 300 concubines, so 1,000 women. So anyway, first of all, both righteousness and wisdom escape mankind. All will inevitably die. And then also the preacher ponders and broods over the limitations of humanity. And this is something that we often don't want to ponder on or think about, is the limitations. We're always talking about the sky's the limit, and we always like the world's your oyster, and all these other cliches out there where man is always trying to not concentrate or think about limitations. However, this book does quite the opposite. It focuses on the limitations of humanity. All right. So now why? You know, for me, the most important question to answer, in my opinion, is not the what question. It's not the how question, but for me, it is the why question. And so what is the purpose, or why is the book there? You know, in fact, I could stand to correction, but when this book was canonized with the Old Testament, it was one of the last to be canonized. The reason being is that the tone was very, as well, when you look at it from a first-hand glance through it, it seems very morbid, but I don't find it that way at all, I must say, from my perspective. But if you do go through it and with a quick glance, you would find it rather morbid, and like you come away thinking, well, there's no point to life. But that's not really the truth of the matter. But needless to say, the book wasn't canonized. It was one of the books that were later, with the book of Esther, that was canonized and consolidated before Christ as the Old Testament, which was the scriptures at the time. There was no Old Testament, New Testament. So those are just some of the points. So why was this book canonized? Why is it there? So what's the role? Well, simply, I believe it was canonized to serve as a reminder of the futility of life without God, and also as a reality check, or to put it in another way, it is a book that serves as an objective, not a subjective, an objective assessment of life on earth, or one's life. You know, we need to be able to have a measure, a bar that is objective, that is not dependent on our subjectiveness, our feelings from our perspective, and so forth. We need something completely in and outside of us. And this is where I believe this book helps bring reality and everything of what's real value into perspective and into focus with absolute clarity. And I thank God for the book of Ecclesiastes. And so with that, let's jump into the first point that comes from this verse that we are considering. And that is, God makes everything beautiful, or has made everything beautiful. Now, interesting, first and foremost, we must not miss that it speaks to the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God, God's absolute autonomy. That means he is under nobody else. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He has the first word and he has the last word in everything. Often from our sinfulness, our sinful state, we tend to forget that. We tend to forget the sovereignty of God, and we seem to see ourselves in the center of the universe. And this is something that we need to submit, hence that cross that we have to pick up daily and die daily, as Luke puts it. All the Gospels mention it, but it's Luke that inserts the word daily when Jesus has that discourse with his disciples. If you want to be my disciple, you need to deny self, pick up your cross, and follow me daily. Luke puts the word daily in there. So with not only does God's desire and his will supersede that of anyone else's, but also his schedule, God's schedule, supersedes any other perceived schedule. Now, you and I may have a schedule, a time frame, a timeline, deadlines. Well, guess what? It is, when it comes to God, it does not take precedence. In fact, we see that it is God's timeline that overarches and encompasses all other timelines. In fact, ours is interwoven into his overarching timeline and his appointed times. For instance, we live and carry out our plans with the preordained seasons and times that God has ordained. So summer and winter will come, and it will go in spite or irrespective of your schedule and your plans. Another point to make on this is that, or an illustration, is that you didn't choose the era in which you were born. We find ourselves in the toenails of iron and clay, and I can't stress that enough when we're looking at the world affairs and what's happening around us and the signs of the times. Jesus is coming again. We find ourselves in this era not by choice, but because someone else has, and that being God, a schedule, a timeline which supersedes ours and every other person that has ever lived. We fit in to this plan and schedule of God's timing. Paul so longed to see our day. Many of the apostles long to be in the toenails of iron and clay. It's funny, some of us might and actually wish we were in their time, in the apostolic, the church of Acts, and not living in this time. So anyway, we're never happy, right? But God's time is God's time, and we have to submit to that. So here's the point. We must accept that God does not work according to our schedule and our time frame. We must also accept and appreciate God's perfect timing. Once we come to this place in our lives, this is when I truly believe that we will experience happiness and far less frustration in our lives. When we haven't accepted this, the fruit of a unsurrendered soul, or a person that hasn't surrendered to God's ultimate sovereignty and autonomy, is the fact that they'll be a very frustrated, very angry person, lacking the patience. Remember, the Bible contains the theme of wait on the Lord. And this verse tells us why. Because God makes everything beautiful in its appropriate time, or as some translations put it, in his time. Not David's time, not so-and-so's time, but in his time. So this is why I believe, and I'm not saying it's the only cause, but I certainly believe that there's a lot of resentment towards God, a lot of bitterness towards God, and unhappiness and in God's and amongst God's people, just as much as we found in Exodus with the Israelites grumbling and moaning. They were grumbling against God. But God does things in his perfect time and in his perfect will. Okay, in addition, we are also told in this passage that God makes everything beautiful. Now, you know, it is interesting because the author chooses to highlight the beauty of God's work and not simply the excellence of God's work. So when you compare this with the passage recorded in Genesis 1, verse 31, Moses describes the work of God not using the word beauty, but he says after each day it was good. And so I'll read to you Genesis 1, verse 31 from the New King James. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So here we find from the comparison of these two passages, we come to the realization that God's work is not simply good or excellent, but it's also beautiful in its nature. So God has taste. Yes, God has taste. You will not find a greater interior designer or exterior designer than God. God is the universe, the greatest interior designer that you will find in the universe. This is the God that we serve. He knows how to fill the space, not only with functionality, but also with loveliness and elegance. Yes, dear friend, God has class. Yes, he's a classy, I don't want to say guy because that just doesn't do justice to who God is, but he has class. Just look around and you can see that for yourself. And this, I believe, is highlighted in this verse, that God makes all things beautiful. He has taste, and he is not only interested in the functionality, but also in the aesthetics. Furthermore, I want to read this quote that's from the SDA commentary, volume 3, page 1075. It says, there not only was everything good, but beautiful also. Aesthetically pleasing, not only perfect or complete for practical use, but lovely in its appeal to the eye and to the taste. Yes, God has taste. But now, you know what is really profound? This is what I found profound. Is that the author does not describe and make this statement in reference to the state of the earth before the fall, before sin. He is describing it from his present state and his point of view or standpoint, which was thousands of years after the fall. So this I find intriguing because he is describing the earth from his standpoint, and he still uses and describes it as the beauty of God's work. So even so, even though sin has maligned God's work, and the effects of sin have ravaged through creation, there is still beauty. So this is the point. Even in a world that has been ravaged and wasted by sin, the beauty of God's work cannot be totally eradicated, in spite of all the effects that we see around us, decay and so forth. We can still stand in awe and fear God as we gaze upon the excellency and beauty of his work. Makes me think of our passage that we as Adventists hold dear, and that is the passage where it says, fear God and give him the glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. But it describes God as the maker of earth, heaven and earth. And it's when we look to the earth that we comprehend the power and the might, or have some vague understanding of the power and might of God and why we ought to fear him. Certainly, it's not enough, but that's all that we human beings can fathom, is what we engage with in this world. And there's enough in this world that leads us to fear God and give him glory, as he should be given. Lastly, on this point, on the first point, is that it is God that makes all things beautiful, not man, not me. You see, in fact, when man does try and do anything, he has a tendency to destroy and mess up things, leaving a path of mayhem and destruction as he goes along. Now, I will entertain the argument that no, man does create some beautiful things. Yes, but there's a but, and here's the but. When man creates something beautiful in space and time, it's at the detriment of something else. Do you follow? Let's take, for instance, some beautiful old building. Can't think, Taj Mahal. That beautiful Taj Mahal was built out of marble. That marble would have had to be quarried. Some pristine, beautiful place in this world had to be carved out and carved up, an open cast mine where they created the slabs that went into building the Taj Mahal. So that's my point, is that while we might create something aesthetically beautiful, we have done damage in the process. And this is the problem with mankind. Unlike God, who is contrasted in this verse, who makes all things beautiful in its appropriate time, we can't do that. As I said, we have more of a tendency to do harm in the process. Well, let's move on to the second point. The second point is this: God plants eternity into the heart. Now, the second clause with the verse begins with the word also. So now that already suggests to you that this second point is as important from the standpoint of the author. Solomon feels that this is just as important and wants us to take note of this point. And so with that, he writes the word, puts the point across that God plants eternity in the hearts. Now, what exactly is meant by this? Well, first of all, you'll find that the King James Version translates the Hebrew word olam into world. Now, that's not quite accurate, because if we look at the verse 14, where the word is used again, olam, that is again translated into the phrase shall be forever. So So that's why you'll find multiple translations again will use the word eternity. And this is how it often comes forth in the Bible. Even if you look up verses like Exodus 21, verse 6, when you take that slave that chooses to be a slave for the rest of his days, in the Bible it says, and you take him to the doorpost and you use an awl and you bore his ear with the awl, and he shall be a servant forever. Again, that's the same word used, olam. So when we look at the context here, it certainly fits better with eternity. And I want to share with that in mind the next point. So what exactly does this phrase mean? God plants eternity in the heart. Well, according to the, again, SDA commentary, the following in regards to this idiomatic speech, it sheds so much light, in fact, so much understanding upon the significance of not only this verse, but also the entire book. I really believe that this is a key passage, one of the key passages in the book of Ecclesiastes that sums up what the author is trying to say, and particularly in this phrase. So it states the following: deeply implanted within man is a concern for the future. Note, it's not a concern for the present, but rather a concern for the future. This awareness of the infinite in time and space stirs dissatisfaction with the transitory, brief, and fleeting nature of things of this life. Furthermore, it goes on to state concerning the dependent clause that follows on in their hearts, that is in their thoughts or in their minds, it is God's design that man realize that the present material world does not constitute the sum of his existence. He is linked to two worlds, physically to this world, but mentally, emotionally, and psychologically to the eternal world. Hence why when death comes, it's like an abrupt interruption that cuts into our lives. It seems to mess up our plans because it seems like we have forever in our minds, even though there's not one of us that has even grasped the infinite, because everything we see around us, everything we've experienced in the empirical evidence around us has a beginning and has an end, albeit that it might have a long lifespan, like some of these trees, those redwood trees in California, that live thousands, hundreds of years, but still there is a limited longevity. It doesn't go on unceasingly. And so for us to comprehend the infinite is rather difficult, but it's there by, the verse says, because God set it in our minds. He planted it there. He gave us this concept of eternity. So when we take these comments, you can conclude the following: mankind, even in his compromised state, is aware in his consciousness of a realm that goes far beyond the material world in which he engages. And this leaves a void, an insatiable hunger for more. Hence Christ's words to Satan, man shall not live by bread alone. You see, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Now it goes without saying, if you live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, that means you can't live without God himself. So nothing in this world will give lasting satisfaction. When will enough of anything be enough? Only God can fill you entirely. Only his word can bring you the satiety that your and my heart craves. The third point, and our last point of this passage, is the whole scope of God's work is unfathomable. And when we look at the root of the word unfathomable, it is an imperial unit. Fathom is an imperial unit that was used as a measure, and it was standardized to 6 feet. It was basically the span of your arms outstretched. That was a fathom. So, of course, some may have slightly longer than 6 feet, but it was standardized. Now, this measure was usually the standard used when it came to measuring the depth of a body of water. So if you're in Howick, they'd measure Mitmar Dam by so many fathoms, if you were still in the imperial system, or the sea, or the ocean. Now, it's interesting, with this in mind, I want to read the following verse again that we are concentrating on, just the latter part, and it's from the NIV. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So the NIV has chosen to use the word fathom. And when you keep that in mind with what we've just discussed as a unit of measure, and particularly when it comes to the depth, and when we think of the ocean, we think of the ocean as something, it's the closest thing that we can get to infinite. When you're standing on the beach and the shore, and you're looking at miles and miles and miles of water out there, it seems infinite, an infinite distance, not to mention the depth that one cannot reach to the depths of the ocean without technology. So it would be the best that we could have to illustrate this point. And here it goes. So it's clear from this statement that the work of God cannot be measured. Now note, it's the work of God that can't be measured. Certainly not by any mere human standard, or concepts or constructs like the literal word fathom, the unit fathom. Humanity just doesn't possess any unit of measurement that can measure the works of God. Now, we're just still talking about his works. We're not talking about God himself. I mean, the heavens are measured, according to the word, by the span of his hand. There's a span from your tip of your thumb to your pinky. God measures the heavens with the span of his hand. Now, that just is incredible. How big is the heavens? It's infinite. And that's just one portion of God's body. And of course, it's put in poetic form. So it's not what it connotes, but rather denotes. It's the connotations that are important, not what it denotes literally. But still, it just shows you how infinite the universe is, and it's expanding, it's growing, it's beyond our minds to get around. So please note, what is implied is just as important. If the work of God is incomprehensible, well, it goes without saying, by default, God himself is infinitely beyond our grasp of understanding. So humanity finds itself at the shores of an infinite gulf between us and God. Hence, when we ponder over the gospel, we come to the realization that only God could and did take the initiative to reach out to humanity over the gulf that stood between us and himself. Hence the name Emmanuel. The transcendent, infinite God of the universe became the immanent God with us. Just profound. You can't even begin to actually fully understand and grasp what took place. in the incarnation. So what can we conclude from this third point? Firstly, as Christians, there's no room for boredom. Yes, no room for boredom. A Christian cannot be bored. The life of a Christian is one of constant discovery, no matter how old you are. You can be 90 or in excess of 90, and there is still room for discovery. You still won't be close to scratching the tip of the iceberg. I will go as far as to say this, that there is no such thing as a truly converted Christian that is bored. In fact, if one finds yourself bored, then I would question whether I am truly born again or converted. You just can't get a bored Christian, no such thing. The second point that comes from this third point or clause that we're looking at is that God's work is indescribable as he himself is. And Isaiah has the following to say according to this point: "To whom then will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things, who brings out their host by number. He calls them all by name. By the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one is missing." Now, and that comes from Isaiah 40, verse 25 and 26. It's important to note that Solomon, when he uses and he writes his book, Ecclesiastes, when you look at the Hebrew word for God, he's chosen to use the word Elohim, Elohim, Almighty, all-powerful God. And it's in reference to this name or title of God. And he could have used Jehovah Jireh, he could have God provides, God, but the context and the book is suggesting the sovereignty of God. And finally, when you come to the last verse, what is the whole duty of man? And that is to keep God's commandments and to do God's will. In essence, that's what he's trying to say. Even in your youth, remember the Lord while you are young, he says. So it's so important that we know that we are not God's little g, demigods running unto ourselves or serving self. We are here to serve God. And we have to understand that and develop this Christo or theocentric, God-centered world view, where he is at the center where he is, and not us at the center, which is, of course, a delusion. But that is what sin does. It seems to make God really small, while it makes us really, really big. And this is the delusion of sin that we need to guard against. Okay, the third point that comes out of this final third point is that no one can fathom entirely and completely what God has created and is doing at present, not even the greatest minds put together. There is no end to learning, and particularly in the knowledge of God. Hence, our knowledge of God and his truth is progressive. And I use the word progressive tentatively, and it's something that we all often forget. We want to put God into a box and say that's that, and anything that comes on or is revealed, we want to shut it out. This is the problem that happened during the Reformation. Why are there so many churches? They established a creed, and this is very dangerous. And this is why our church is a movement. It never formulated a creed. This is what we called our creed. We didn't formulate a creed, but we said the word of God is our creed. And it is so that we allow God to be God, who is revealing himself in time and constantly progressing in the knowledge of God and understanding. It needs to be growing throughout the whole span of our life. In fact, even in eternity, we can never say that we fully and totally comprehend this infinite being. Otherwise, he would cease to be God, because the infinite wouldn't be infinite if you could fully comprehend who he is. And so we cannot put our knowledge of God and fix it in stone. In fact, I would say that is a subtle form of idolatry, because if you put God into a box, perhaps it's a God of your own making, a construct in your own mind, and not the actual God of the universe, the God who is described as love. All right, so I want to finish off with an illustration and a story of the fig tree. I like always leaning on the experience of nature and my time in the bush as a game ranger. I'm not sure if you're aware of the fig tree. The ficus species around the world, there are over 700, I think estimated to close to 750 species of fig trees around the world that make up the genus Ficus. Now, each one of these trees has a species-specific wasp, a wasp that lives in a mutual symbiosis with the tree. And the figs that we call the fruit are not the fruit. They're actually the receptacle. The flowers are inside. That's why we never see flowers on a fig tree. We see the fruit, but it's not the fruit, as I said. And that is because the flowers, tiny little flowers, are in the inside of that fruit. Now, each little bud, or not each little bud, some of the buds contain eggs of the wasp. And that little bud will then hatch out this little wasp, and the male will be like a maggot, flightless, and the female will have wings. Once they've mated, the female will crawl and force her way through the tiny hole that's in the fig at the top or at the apex. But she has to really push and squeeze through there. But at the same time, pollen is rubbed off on this wasp, and then it does its maiden voyage, and its one and only voyage, flight, and that is to another suitable fig, where she will fly to and then go reverse the process, squeeze through the opening, and at the same time pollinating the flowers that she brushes up against, finds a suitable bud that hasn't opened yet, and lays another egg to start the cycle all over. Now the question comes to mind, and this is the object for the atheist, the objection to the atheist, which came first? Because each one of these wasps and each one of these fig tree species had to exist simultaneously. Their association is compulsory. They cannot live without the other. They are codependent. Now, this just blows my mind. The intricacies of the mind that developed such a complex relationship, not to mention the organisms that are involved in this relationship. I just can't wrap my head around that. But here's the thing. Not so long ago, about 2,000 years ago, there was a man called Zacchaeus, and this man was short. But before this man was born, God knew, like as he knows all of us before we are born. He says in Psalms, we are wonderfully made, fearfully and wonderfully made. We are made in the image of God, and he knits us together. And God knew Zacchaeus before he was born, as he knows all of us before we are born, as it states in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. And God provides the resources, the means for Zacchaeus to reach Christ. You see, God truly makes all things beautiful in its appropriate time. That sycamore fig that was growing there in Jericho was pollinated, deposited there at the right time, at the right place, and there was a means for Zacchaeus, who was vertically challenged, to find a means to see Christ, to reach Christ. And what's amazing is that Christ knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't go up there and look around. He looked straight up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. And there's no reference of Jesus ever meeting him before that time, but Jesus knew him by name and called out to him. It just amazes me how God orchestrates everything in its appointed time. Everything God makes beautiful. And what a beautiful occasion that was when the salvation came to that home of Zacchaeus. Not only to Zacchaeus, but his whole household experienced the salvation of God. That is the beauty of God and his work. And in conclusion, I just want to say that to live a fulfilled and contented life, it can only be experienced once the reader has fully grasped the thought and the main idea that is proposed by the author of verse 11. The joy and true contentment that is experienced when one comes to appreciate the immensity of these truths, it will lead naturally to good works and deeds that flow from a heart of gratitude and awe and amazement. One will certainly step closer in realizing their purpose, which is found in enjoying whatever we have been given by God and all the beauty that surrounds us, and not in what we can accumulate or what we can hoard up in this world. Now, with all this amazing, indescribable knowledge, go make your life count, my brother and my sister. Go make your life count with God. It's never too late. Go make your life count with God and not without him. And you will find that you have far more purpose than you could ever have imagined. And with that, I just want to read you a song that I used to really like singing. I was introduced to it when I was at Ambila in the youth. We used to sing this song, and it goes like this. I finally realized, I think it was the Gators that wrote it, one of the Gators. Something beautiful, something good. All my confusion, he understood. All I had to offer him was brokenness and strife, but he made something beautiful of my life. If there ever were dreams that were lofty and noble, they were my dreams at the start. And hope for life's best were the hopes that I harbor down deep in my heart. But my dreams turned to ashes, and my castles all crumbled. My fortune turned to loss. So I wrapped it all in the rags of life and laid it at the cross. I could not have ended or said it better. God bless you all.